Have you ever faced the person who once ruined your life and had to decide whether to forgive them? Today's story will take you right to that moment, where one choice between hatred and mercy changes everything. What would you do if the person who once hurt you the most suddenly needed your help? Stay tuned to find out. And if you enjoy stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss our next videos. The night air is thick and quiet when James suddenly slams on the brakes. His headlights catch a figure slumped against a tree by the roadside. Thin, pale, barely standing. His heart jolts. "John!" he calls out, voice trembling. The man looks up slowly. Red eyes, dirt-stained clothes, a faint, tired smile. "It's been a while," John murmurs. James steps out, confusion flooding his face. "You were given 5 years. Why are you out already?" His tone edges between disbelief and suspicion. John's lips twitch into a bitter smile. "My father confessed, sold everything, took the blame. They reduced my time." For a moment, no one speaks. The only sound is the restless wind dragging dry leaves across the asphalt. Memories crash into James. The late-night threats, the fear in Diep's eyes, the endless tension that had haunted their lives. He grips the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. Beside him, Diep sits frozen, her heart tight as old pain flickers alive. "I've got nowhere to go," John says finally, head bowed. His voice is rough, almost broken. James looks at him through the windshield, seeing not the man who once betrayed them, but someone hollowed out by regret. His expression softens, but his jaw stays firm. The silence stretches until Diep reaches across the seat and squeezes his hand. A small, trembling gesture that says more than words. Her touch is warm, grounding. James exhales slowly. "Get in. We'll talk later." John hesitates, eyes darting between them, then nods and climbs into the back seat. The smell of sweat, dust, and despair fills the car. As they pull back onto the road, the hum of the engine feels heavier than the silence itself. In the rearview mirror, James glimpses John curled up in the corner, gaze lost somewhere between guilt and exhaustion. Diep stares out the window, the reflection of streetlights sliding across her face like fleeting thoughts. Forgive or stay guarded? Her mind churns between the two. Outside, the last light of day fades. Shadows lengthen, crawling across the road, dragging all their unresolved questions along. After a while, James breaks the silence. "His father confessed. The family's in ruins," he says quietly, almost to himself. Diep doesn't answer, just watches the dark field slide by. The wind sneaks in through a crack in the window, brushing her hair. She closes her eyes. Even after everything, there's something unbearably human about seeing John so lost. James glances at her. "I'm thinking of letting him stay at the old house. What do you think?" Diep's fingers tighten in her lap. Memories of the nights she cried because of him flash before her. Nights she thought would never end. But the man in the back seat isn't the same John who once made her afraid. "The fault wasn't only his," she whispers. "Sometimes people just lose their way. Everyone deserves a chance to make things right." James keeps his eyes on the road, nodding slightly. Her words sink deep, loosening something inside him that's been knotted for years. He reaches over and squeezes her hand, this time firmly. A quiet understanding passes between them, a shared decision without needing to say it aloud. The road bends, and James slows. Moments later, the car turns around. They retrace their path until the same old tree appears under the faint glow of moonlight. John's silhouette still lingers there, small and uncertain, as if he'd been left behind by time itself. James stops the car and lowers the window. "Get in," he calls softly. "We're going to Diep's old house." John looks up, disbelief flickering in his eyes. Tears spill down his cheeks before he can speak. He nods, wiping his face with a trembling hand. Diep gives a faint, weary smile and opens the back door. John climbs in again, quieter this time, the gratitude in his silence almost too heavy to bear. As the car moves forward once more, something changes in the air. The bitterness between them starts to fade, replaced by something fragile but real: compassion. Diep turns to James, her eyes catching his for a moment. She doesn't need to say a word. Her look says everything. We've chosen forgiveness. Outside, the wind rushes through the slightly open window, carrying the faint scent of fresh earth, the smell of a new beginning. The road unwinds before them, dark but strangely calm. No one speaks. John leans his head against the glass, lost in thought. James drives steadily, his face softer now. Diep rests her head against the seat, eyes heavy but peaceful. For the first time in years, the silence feels gentle instead of cruel. Ahead, at the edge of dusk, the outline of the old house slowly appears. Faded walls, peeling paint, the roof bowed like an old memory refusing to crumble. James stops the car and cuts the engine. The sudden quiet makes their breathing sound louder. Diep steps out first. The ground is damp, the smell of grass and dust rising around her. Every creak of the wooden door brings back pieces of her past. Laughter, arguments, the cries of a baby named Nye. She walks through the doorway. The air inside is musty, heavy with time. James follows, pushing open the windows to let the wind rush in. Dust spins in the fading light, like tiny ghosts finally set free. They begin moving around in silence, unfolding old blankets, checking pots, stacking rice and food on the small table. Everything feels like preparation for something more than just a place to stay. It feels like closure. Diep picks up an old pillow. Her hands tremble as she presses it to her chest. She remembers long nights sitting here, humming lullabies to Nye, waiting for dawn. Her throat tightens. Behind her, John stands awkwardly by the doorway, his eyes red again. "I don't deserve this," he says quietly. "After everything I did." Diep turns, her voice gentle but firm. "Everyone makes mistakes, John. What matters is what you do after." James steps forward and places a hand on his shoulder. "Lev, right this time. If you ever need help, just call." John nods, tears dropping onto the cold cement floor. He wipes them quickly, ashamed, yet thankful. Diep smiles faintly, her own eyes glistening. "Your family may be broken," she says softly, "but you can still rebuild." James wraps an arm around Diep's shoulder. "We know what it's like to lose everything," he murmurs. "That's why we're here." The air between them shifts, heavy grief giving way to something quieter, something human. When they finally step out of the house, night has fully settled. The street light casts a yellow glow across the yard. John stands by the doorway, his shadow long, his face streaked with tears, but carrying, for the first time in years, a glimmer of hope. The wind rises again, rustling through the trees like a soft sigh, a sign that maybe forgiveness really can change everything. The next morning breaks quietly. Dew clings to the grass, and the old house stands still under a pale sky. Inside, John sits by the window, eyes tracing the sunlight creeping through the cracks in the wooden wall. He hasn't slept. The weight of guilt and gratitude presses equally on his chest. Footsteps echo from outside. James carrying a bag of bread and hot coffee. Diep follows, holding a thermos. When John stands to greet them, his voice catches. "You didn't have to come." James sets the bag on the table and shrugs. Breakfast isn't a favor, it's just normal. For a moment, John looks at him, confused, then nods slowly. Diep pours coffee into a chipped cup and slides it toward him. "Eat something. You look like you haven't in days." John hesitates, then takes a bite. The bread tastes plain, but his throat tightens anyway. "I don't deserve this kindness," he murmurs. Diep meets his eyes. "Maybe not before, but you're here now. That's what matters." A long pause stretches between them, a kind that doesn't hurt, just feels unfamiliar. James clears his throat, breaking the silence. "We're not here to judge you, John. What's done is done. You've got a chance now. Don't waste it." John nods, eyes glassy. "I won't. I swear." The three of them sit together, the sound of birds fluttering through the open window. It's quiet, peaceful, too peaceful for what they've been through. After breakfast, Diep starts cleaning, wiping dust off shelves, folding old blankets. James helps fix the door hinge, hammering softly. John lingers awkwardly, unsure how to join in. "Hand me that nail," James says. John blinks, startled, then moves quickly. Their hands brush, a momentary spark of awkwardness that feels strangely healing. Hours pass. The sun climbs higher. The old house begins to look alive again. Windows open, curtains fluttering, faint traces of laughter filling the space. At noon, Diep wipes sweat from her forehead. "It almost feels like home again," she says softly. James looks around, nodding. It's strange, isn't it? Sometimes rebuilding a place helps rebuild people too. John leans against the wall, breathing deeply. This house, I remember when we used to come here after school, before everything fell apart. Diep glances at him, expression softening. "We all made mistakes back then. You, me, everyone. But the difference is, we get to choose how the story ends." John swallows hard, words stuck in his throat. "I'll find work, any kind. I just want to start over." James hands him a folded piece of paper. "I called a friend at the construction site in town. They need hands. It's rough work, but honest." John's eyes widen. "You did that for me?" James shrugs. "Let's just say it's your first test. Show us you mean it." John nods vigorously, emotion thick in his voice. "I won't let you down." Diep smiles faintly. "Just don't disappear again." The afternoon light turns golden, spilling warmth across the faded walls. They eat lunch together. Rice, eggs, simple food. John eats quietly, savoring every bite as if he's tasting normal life for the first time in years. When they finish, James stands and stretches. "We'll leave you to rest. Tomorrow, I'll take you to meet my friend." John follows them to the door. His voice trembles. "Thank you, both of you, for seeing me as more than what I was." Diep pauses, looking at him one last time. "Everyone deserves a chapter 2, John. Make yours worth reading." They walk to the car. As it rolls away, Diep looks back through the rear window. John standing alone by the gate, sunlight cutting across his face. He doesn't wave, but the gratitude in his eyes says everything. Days pass. John starts work at the construction site. The labor is hard, sweat, bruises, aching arms. But for the first time, he doesn't complain. He works silently, steadily, determined to earn every breath of his new life. Sometimes, at dusk, he sits outside the old house, watching the road fade into the horizon. He thinks of the night James stopped the car. One choice, one word, forgiveness, had changed everything. Meanwhile, Diep and James return to their routines, but something feels lighter between them now. The burden they carried, anger, guilt, resentment, has thinned. At dinner, they talk about John sometimes. He's trying, James says one night. He's different now. Diep smiles softly. Maybe forgiveness changes the forgiver more than the forgiven. Weeks turn into months. The old house slowly transforms. John plants vegetables in the small yard, paints the walls, fixes the roof. The locals start greeting him again. He's still quiet, but his eyes no longer look lost. One evening, rain pours hard. James's phone buzzes. A message from John. The roof leaks again, but I'll fix it. Thank you for believing in me. James shows it to Diep. She reads it, smiles, and nods. He's rebuilding more than a house. Months later, the three of them meet again, this time at the market. John's hair is shorter, his clothes cleaner, his posture straighter. When he sees them, he grins, an honest, warm grin they've never seen before. Look at you, James says, clapping his shoulder. Didn't think I'd ever see this version of you. John laughs, a little awkward, but proud. It's strange. Working hard feels good. Feels real. Diep eyes him carefully. You seem happy. John nods. I am. Not rich, not perfect, but I'm finally at peace. They share coffee at a nearby stall, rain drizzling softly outside. The conversation flows easily now. No tension, no ghosts. Just people who've learned to let go. At one point, John looks at Diep. I used to think forgiveness was weakness. Now I see its strength. Yours, not mine. You saved me without even knowing it. Diep shakes her head gently. We just gave you a chance. You saved yourself. A comfortable silence follows. The world outside hums with life. Vendors calling, children laughing, rain tapping on tin roofs. It feels ordinary, but to them, it's extraordinary. When they part ways, John stands for a while, watching their car fade down the street. He breathes deeply, the scent of wet earth and coffee wrapping around him. For the first time, his heart feels quiet. Years later, the old house stands firm, freshly painted, flowers blooming in front. Inside, framed on a shelf, is a small photograph. John, James, and Diep, smiling under the afternoon sun. Visitors sometimes ask who they are, and John only says, friends who believed in second chances. At sunset, he often steps outside, leaning against the same tree where James first found him. The wind brushes past, carrying the same soft rustle of leaves, but it no longer sounds like whispers of regret. It sounds like peace. Somewhere down the road, James and Diep walk hand in hand. Their lives have moved on, but that night remains etched in them. The night they chose mercy over anger, and in doing so, healed a wound they didn't know was still open. As the sky fades from gold to blue, John looks toward the horizon and smiles. Life hasn't been easy, but it's honest now, and that's enough. Because sometimes redemption doesn't come from punishment, but from a door left open, a voice that says, get in, we'll talk later. And in that simple act of grace, everything begins again.
Jim and Diep are driving and they unexpectedly find John, the man who was shattering their feet, standing alone by the roadside. Torn between anger and compassion, Jim hesitates, but Diep, quiet strength, leads them to offer him help. They bring John to Diep's old house, where forgiveness begins to heal years of pain. As John faced his guilt and started rebuilding his life, the three discover that redemption isn't found in punishment, but in kindness. Over time, Ron transforms from broken man into someone reborn through trust and hard work. The story ends not with revenge, but with renewal, a powerful reminder that forgiveness can mend even the deepest wound, and that sometimes small acts of mercy can change an entire life.